Okay, we are now live. So welcome everyone to this webinar. We are very happy to bring back Michael Johnson of Michael Johnson Legal. And this is being put on by the Student Doctor Network. We are a website and published by a nonprofit, and our goal is to help students become doctors. And I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide here, if I can figure this one out. There we go. We offer a lot of free resources. So if you are a student, if you are a current medical student or dental student, we offer a lot of resources that can help you with your process of becoming a healthcare professional. You can see on our website a list of all the different resources. A lot of people know us for the Student Doctor Network forums community, but we offer a number of additional resources as well. And so we invite folks to come check those out. And one of those resources is our webinars. And as I mentioned, we're very happy to be welcoming back Michael Johnson, who focuses his practice on physician contracts. I'm going to go ahead and move him over to see if I can get him to, hold on. There we go. Having technical issues here. So let me get to, there we go. Okay. And then actually, we'll just put you on. Okay. Anyway, I guess this will do for now. Okay. Well, we can go ahead and get started. So first, as I mentioned, Michael Johnson Legal focuses on helping physicians evaluate, negotiate, and enforce their physician contracts. And today we wanted to talk about what employers do to get you to sign an employment contract and how they try to protect their investment in the costs they've put up to get you hired, and the different clauses that they put in, including things like non-compete, non-solicit, malpractice insurance and tail costs, exclusive employment, compensation, clawback, and waiver issues. Since new physicians often want to change their jobs in the first few years, it's difficult to pick that perfect position right out of your training. So we're going to talk about the misalignment of interests and how to protect your options to leave your first job. So with that, we will go ahead and get started. And then there we got Michael up there, and we can start doing questions. If you do have any questions, please feel free to enter those questions in if you're on YouTube, you can put them in there, or on either of the Facebook channels, you can put them in there. But to start out, we'll go ahead and go with one of our questions, which is, what are some of the tactics that employers use to try and keep employees from leaving?
Yeah, so this could also be why does my law firm exist? So quick intro for me. I'm a lawyer. I help physicians evaluate, negotiate, and occasionally enforce physician contracts. And I help physicians in all specialties and across the country. And I represent a lot of first contract physicians. And a lot of first contract physicians come in and say, okay, why do employment contracts exist? What is the point? What are employers concerned about? Why are we even here? A article recently came out by the AMA. It was pretty stark. It said that it costs, every time a physician changes jobs, an employer loses a physician, it costs as much as $500,000 to $1 million. Between lost revenues, lost efficiency, like lost allocation of staff. Just it costs a ton of money when physicians change jobs. And it's particularly expensive when physicians change jobs early career. Okay, when you start, your first job during the first couple of weeks, first couple of months, maybe first year or so, or sometimes even more, you're not going to always be as busy, as efficient as someone who's been doing it for 5 or 10 years. Okay. Sometimes the ramp up is faster. Sometimes it's a little bit slower. It really just depends. So for employers that are hiring first contract physicians, folks coming out of training, there's going to be a significant financial loss, frankly, early on. So if you add that on top of all the other costs of a physician changing jobs, it becomes very, very important for employers of physicians to do what they can to try to maybe mitigate that a little bit. One of the most obvious ways to mitigate that would be to create an incredibly attractive work environment. And look, I think a lot of employers are trying, but that is a very difficult thing to execute on all the time. But another thing that they try to do is maybe structure their employment contracts in a way that makes it very expensive, very difficult to change careers, to pivot, to do something else within the first couple years. Okay. Some physician contracts gets a little bit easier to transition after 2 or 3 or 5 years. It really just depends. But there's often significant financial disincentives to you leaving a job within the first few years. One of the most obvious issues is that signing bonus. Many of you will make, I don't know, somewhere between $50,000 and $80,000 for the next few years. And that sounds better than zero in medical school or zero in college, obviously. But it gets kind of painful, especially when you start getting into your later 20s or your earlier 30s and you have a few more responsibilities. It gets a little bit more challenging to kind of live comfortably in those numbers. And employers know this, and they're often very willing to pay you some money to sign an employment agreement, sometimes even a year or 2 years. I worked with someone 3.5 years in advance signing an employment contract not too long ago. But often to entice you to do that, they'll offer you a significant signing bonus. And it sounds all well and good, but that signing bonus should really be thought of as payment for work that you haven't done yet. And if you don't stay for however many years that are assigned to that signing bonus, then you might have to pay back some or all, sometimes all of it. So imagine you get a signing bonus of $50,000. Sometimes it can require you to pay it all back, maybe even with interest, sometimes 6, 8, 10% in interest. If your contract ends for any reason, even if the employer lets you go, ends for any reason during the first 2 to 5 years. So that can be very painful. That's a very, very common employer tactic to try to disencourage early career transitions. I probably have a couple hundred examples of these through my representations in the firm, but that's one of the most obvious ways. There's a number of other expenses like malpractice insurance and tail coverage. Sometimes you have to buy an insurance policy to cover malpractice claims that are made against you after you leave a job. Sometimes your employer doesn't pay for that. Let's say you leave a job and unfortunately, maybe you committed malpractice during your employment, but that claim is made after you leave employment. Sometimes your employer does not actually pay for that malpractice claim. You have to buy a separate policy. That policy can be very expensive. So again, another way that employers maybe increase the costs of you leaving early career. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. So that's there we go. That does make sense on how people they will try and keep you locked into your location there. I know another way that they often try to keep you locked in is with non-compete clauses. So I know we talked in a previous discussion a little bit about non-compete clauses. So if you could just give a little bit of an overview of those and what concerns or things you should be looking at when an employer proposes in a contract a non-compete clause.
Non-compete clauses in physician employment contracts are exceedingly common. Okay, very, very common. I would love for like them to not be legal. Unfortunately, they still are legal. It's certainly possible. We're recording this March 18th of 2024. The expectation is that sometime in April, the FTC might attempt to make all non-compete clauses across the country unenforceable. Might be something that lands within the next few weeks. So the next bit of discussion might be a little bit a little bit untimely, depending on what happens. My theory is that there will be some attempts to make non-competes unenforceable, but I think that they will ultimately fail in courts. But we'll see. Okay, but let's back up for a moment. Non-compete clauses speak to where you can practice after you leave a job. So a lot of physician contracts, it's not like Starbucks where you can go to Dunkin' across the street the next day and just work there. Like, it doesn't really work that way. A lot of employers place a geographic restriction on where you can practice post-employment. A common one will be for 2 years after your employment with us, you cannot practice medicine within 20 miles of your primary work location. Pretty common. There's a ton of different ways to evaluate and negotiate those. From a very practical standpoint, if you pull that map up and you say, okay, during this 20-mile bubble around this location, if that doesn't really restrict me very much, okay, it doesn't really have an impact on me being able to get my next job, like, it doesn't really matter that much, then often as a practical matter, the law firm, we recommend folks focus their negotiation leverage elsewhere on something that's more valuable. Really just depends, okay? But if that geographic restriction is actually restrictive on you, it has an impact on your ability to live and work where you want to live and work, then there's a number of different ways that you might want to consider negotiating that. It really stems from where is your next best option. So if your next best option is probably going to be very, very close by to your current work location, then reducing that 20-mile non-compete down to 10 is still going to knock out that your next best option, right? So don't ask for that. In that case, I typically recommend physicians ask for like a 1-year non-compete or maybe a 6-month non-compete instead of 2 years. You go do locums for a year, 6 months, and then you can take that job that you really want close by. Okay. The flip side is if, let's say 10 miles is very helpful to you and 20 miles is very restrictive, then you might want to negotiate on miles. There are other ways to negotiate. You can negotiate based on reason for termination. A reality of physician contracts is that the vast majority of first draft offers will have an enforceable non-compete even if the employer terminates you without cause. Imagine that. You are working a job, you want to be there, you're trying your best, you're showing up every day, you're not committing malpractice, you're doing your job, right? Let's say they want to hire somebody else. They want to find someone that makes them more money, or maybe they just don't have enough volume to support your practice. Okay. In those situations, in the vast majority of physician contracts, they can terminate your contract and force you to go 20 miles away. Doesn't seem very fair, right? If you're doing your job and they don't do their job, then fairness would dictate that the non-compete should not be enforceable, but you often have to negotiate for that. There are so many nuances here. I could talk for the next hour just about this one. So, like, I've negotiated probably 100 different ways or more, and understanding these clauses are very important for physician contracts. They are often negotiable. A lot of employers will say we don't go negotiate the non-compete. They'll just say that. But what they often mean is that we're not going to remove the non-compete in full. A lot of employers have some options that they're willing to consider to reduce it or, try to tighten it up a little bit, depending on how you ask. So you got to, frankly, bring someone in that knows what they're doing in the space and help you navigate this particular clause. So that's how you should approach a non-compete. You should, one, expect it to be enforced. Number two, understand how it restricts you. Does it restrict you a little or a lot? And then think also, I guess number three would be, where is your next best option? And can you expand that? Can you improve that through negotiation? And then get some help with the nitty-gritty details of that.
Great. Thank you for that detailed answer on the non-competes. And yeah, I'm hopeful that they'll get rid of that. But as you said, chances are good that it's not going to hold up in court. So we'll see.
My theory is that the FTC will probably pass some sort of restriction, some sort of ban. It might have a carve out for income, high income status, which would knock out physicians. Okay. Or it might have a carve out based on industry. So, like folks in finance and real estate and healthcare have all been like petitioning, writing their senators saying, like, hey, look, can we have a carve out for our industry? We really need non-competes. It's totally, important to us, that sort of thing. The American Hospitals Association is leading the charge. They, probably have written everybody under the sun about this, trying to get non-competes. So, we'll see if the FTC agrees with that and, removes physicians from this under a carve out, or if like the courts push back and invalidate the law. We'll see where it goes, but we're all guessing at this point.
Great. Thank you. And I just want to remind everyone, if you want to ask a question, feel free to put that in on either Facebook or YouTube, wherever you're watching this, and we can put it up on screen and try and answer that question for you. One thing that I've seen a lot, and this has been particularly true, I think, for ER physicians, is sale of the employer. So like they join and it's a nice little hospital that they're working for and it's great. And then it gets sold to a venture capital company or a private equity. And all of a sudden things change. So what are some protections that you can potentially put into your agreement to protect yourself in that case, so that if your employer is sold, that you then have options and you're not like basically trapped in an unhappy marriage with an organization that you would not have ever chosen to be aligned with?
This happens quite a bit, actually. So I'm glad you asked this question. Really good one. A really important clause to protect you here is the termination without cause clause. You and the employer need the option to walk away, in my opinion, really at any time. Even if you've been there working there for one day, you should have the option to leave. About 1 in maybe 10, maybe 1 in 15 first draft employment agreements that we see in the firm will not have a right to leave for 2 or 3 years. It can be very painful, right? Imagine the employer changes hands or the job just doesn't turn out the way that you had hoped. That can be very painful, to be stuck in a job for 2 or 3 years that makes you very unhappy. So I really love prioritizing that. If the employer changes hands, if the employer's interview promises just don't pan out, things can change. Okay, things can change quite rapidly. So the typical clause here is a bilateral right. So you and the employer have the same right to terminate without cause with a protected off-ramp, meaning you and the employer must continue working and they got to continue paying you, okay, in full for a certain period of time. Okay, you want to leave, they want to leave, you give notice, and you got to keep working. They keep paying you for a certain amount of time. 90 to 180 days is the norm. It can be a little bit shorter in maybe some private practices, maybe some smaller practices. I'll see it very short in maybe like dermatology practices with a patient panel, but in your emergency medicine hypothet, 90 to 180 days makes a lot of sense. I don't think you're stealing any patients on your way out in emergency medicine. That'd be a little silly, right? So that doesn't really factor in. That gives you the option to say, okay, if things change, all I got to do is give 90 to 180 days of notice and I can walk away. You can find a job between now and then, but that can be important. I've seen and I've negotiated for a waiver of the non-compete if the employer changes hands. Some folks do that, some folks don't. It depends on your negotiation leverage and how much you focus on it and a number of other factors where you're going to win that change or not. But I've asked for it and I've gotten that into contracts. Kind of like a poison pill, if you will, that says, hey, if we change hands, then you have the right. Sometimes it's conditioned on you exercising that right within 6 months. The employer can't change hands today, and then you show up in 2034 and you're like, hey, 10 years ago y'all changed hands. That wouldn't really make a lot of sense, right? But often if you ask for some sort of like timeline to change jobs, then that can be worked in. Also, understanding how much it's going to cost you to leave is important. So if you have enough funds in your bank account, enough cash on hand to be able to pay off any of the malpractice tail expenses, any of the compensation clawback and waiver issues like that signing bonus, if you got to pay back a portion of that but it's not in your bank account anymore, your employer changes hands and is now treating you poorly, it's not what you signed up for. If you don't have that signing bonus in your bank account, you can't pull from available cash to pay it back, you're probably stuck. So part of it is planning on your side, part of it is negotiating your contract. Number of nuances here. If you have a specific concern, then definitely consider counsel. I also like the idea of, like in your emergency medicine hypothet, being able to moonlight. So let's say your main contract requires 14 12-hour shifts per month, and that's your full-time gig as an emergency medicine physician. If you have an active moonlighting gig, maybe it's 20.1 miles away from your primary employment. It really just depends. Maybe the non-compete forces you to go outside a little bit. But let's say you have a place where you pick up, 1 or 2 PRN shifts a month. You do a little bit on the side from time to time. If you like it, if it's steady, if you have a good relationship with a second source of income, now it makes it easier to potentially leave your primary employment. You could say, okay, hey, I might be available more than 2 times a month very soon. Like, can I just ramp up my work with you? And it makes it sometimes easier to leave a job. So that works. Works for emergency medicine, hospital-based medicine, really anybody like inpatient. Depends on your specialty. Anesthesia, that would make a lot of sense. Really just depends. Some of the more like heavy procedure based, it can be a little bit more difficult to moonlight. Sometimes that it makes sense to focus all of your energies on one employer and you just plan your exit strategy a little bit differently. But depending on your specialty, having an active moonlighting gig could be very helpful to I guess just prepare yourself if something drastic changes with your employer.
Great, thank you. And then again, moving on to like, it's not working out. So, like you said, you should have an exit strategy because eventually you're always going to leave whatever employer you have. either you work there for 40 years and you retire, or something doesn't work out, you decide to move, things like that. So if it's not working out, something's changed and you need to leave, what should be your process for dealing with that?
Yeah. First thing would be to review your exit strategy. Make sure you understand how much you would have to pay to leave, where you can work, and how much time you have to give. Okay, what does your termination without cause clause look like? Okay, once you have a general idea, I typically recommend folks um, look for a new job first. Unless you're financially independent from work, like you no longer need to work for money, you've saved up money, or maybe you have a pretty substantial savings, or maybe you're a multiple income household, so you don't need both incomes or something like that. Maybe you're different. But if you really, you and your family need an income each month to kind of meet your needs, then it gets really hard to terminate your contract before you have another one in hand. Also, as a physician, it takes a little bit of time to get a new job. You will probably do some initial phone call interviews. You'll probably talk to some recruiters, and you'll probably spend a few weeks looking at kind of collecting a couple opportunities. Okay. You might have a handful of phone interviews. You might go do some site visits for a couple employers that you're excited about. Okay. Next, you might get an offer letter. You may or may not negotiate the offer letter. Next, you'll probably almost certainly get a contract. If you're very prudent, you're going to get a physician contract experienced lawyer to help you navigate that. If you're negotiating that contract, it might take a few to several weeks even to negotiate that contract. After that, you have some post contract just stuff that has to get done. You got to get hospital privileges. You might need a medical license in a new state. You might need to get approved. There's a bunch of paperwork to get approved with various new payors. Like, it doesn't just happen like that. So you kind of start from the end and start backing up through all of those processes. You probably need at least 3 to 6 months. Less than 3 months, you're probably missing some paychecks. 6 months is probably enough in most instances to get that stuff done. However, there's a couple states that are really slow with approving medical licenses right now. California is one of them. If any of you are looking at getting a job in California anytime soon, you really need to apply for your medical license, pretty far in advance. I would say, to be safe, like 8, 9, 10 months in advance, like quite a bit. It takes I've had a couple clients this cycle that ran into that problem, that couldn't start on August of 2023, had to wait until September, October, or November because the medical licensing board was slow. So anyways, getting back to our question, if you think about that timeline, all those steps that need to happen, you got to start early. Okay, you need at least 6 months, I would say, of ramp to make sure it gets done. Okay. So those are the steps to get your new job. Before you submit your notice of termination for your current job, I would encourage you to think long and hard if there's something that would fix the problem. If you can negotiate with your current employer and you have another option that you can leave for, and they know that, then now they kind of really need to listen to you, or they need to be okay with losing a physician. Remember, at the beginning of this webinar, it costs about $500,000 to $1 million every time a physician turns over. So if you have an option to leave, if you're about to leave, they got a massive financial incentive to maybe think about keeping you happy. So I would encourage you, before you submit your notice of termination, to think about what would be sufficient, if anything, to make you stay. Okay, and think about working that out with your employer. If there really isn't anything, then a couple steps: you can make sure you submit your request for PTO. A lot of employers will turn down your PTO request during your termination notice provisions timeline. So let's say you have a 6-month notice. and let's say you have 10 or 20 days of PTO stacked up, you might lose them and you might not be allowed to take them, or they might deny some of your requests if they're not already in. But I see most employers allowing you to take it if it's already been approved. So I think about like at least 2 to 4 weeks before, submit all of your PTO requests for at least the next 6 months. Like, make sure you try to work it down to zero, because you typically don't get a cash payment for not taking PTO. It's typically waived. There might be some specific states that kind of push back on this idea, but the general idea and your general expectation should be that you just work. Like, you don't actually get payment if you waived your PTO. So put in for your PTO. Same thing for continuing medical education. Most physician contracts will allow a budget of maybe $3,000 to $7,000 for attending annual meetings, for ongoing education, for literature, for anything associated with maintaining your medical license. Sometimes they'll also pay for your home internet, for a computer, for a new phone. Understand what they can pay. That's part of your compensation. Like, it's yours. Like, you can use it. Understand what the rules are and consider, submitting any expenses that are appropriate under whatever the policy is for your CME. So that can save you a couple or a few grand right there. Here's some other things. Understand, like, when you submit your notice of termination, I would make sure you communicate with the employer about what happens when patients or staff ask you about your departure. It can get a little hairy. Like, if you're unhappy and you leave and you have a relationship with patients and you have a relationship with staff, their just natural human condition is like, hey, where are you going? What are you doing? I'm excited for you, or I want to know. A lot of I see some issues pop up when there's a bit of like oversharing in that situation. Employers might get a bit sensitive about that, so consider maybe not skywriting how excited you are to leave for the local competitor. Sometimes that can just be problematic. Just be thoughtful there. I don't have any other specific advice besides that, but yeah, I think that's about it that I can think of right now.
Now, is it common for, you mentioned staff, to have some kind of non-compete from a staff perspective, like what's the word? You can't like lure away staff from them.
Yeah,
Often, I
it
would
can be
imagine.
called a non-solicit of employees. Sometimes it's called a no hire clause. Sometimes it's called an anti-raid or anti-piracy clause. Like, I've seen it written as like the anti-piracy clause in the contract. It's kind of silly, right? But the general idea is this: most physician contracts make it problematic to fire the boss. Like, imagine let's say your outpatient primary care at a hospital. You might really like your MA, you might like your nurse, you might like the group around you. You might just want to fire the boss and take that group, across the street or maybe 20.1 miles away and recreate what you're already doing. Most physician contracts make affecting employment of others around you legally problematic. There's actually as much or more litigation around the non-solicit of employees clause as anything else. As much as it costs employers a bunch of money when you turn over, it's also exceedingly expensive when your staff turns over. Staffing in healthcare is exceedingly expensive. So I see a lot of employers very protective over that. I often the non-solicit and like no hire, anti-raid clauses have no geographic limits. So theoretically, like, I don't know, you work in San Diego and you wanted to bring your MA to Wisconsin. I don't It technically applies. I haven't seen that hypothet in a case, but that'd be a bit of a stretch. But the general idea is it's not limited by geography, so you want to pay close attention to that. Make sure you understand what you can say or do with staff, with your coworkers, with your colleagues upon exit. Usually, physicians might want to like two or three go together, like that stability of starting a private practice together might be very attractive, but often physician contracts make that problematic.
And I assume usually those anti-piracy, anti-raid, they have time limits as well. So, just like with the non-compete, you have, 20 miles in 2 years. Is it similar with the non-solicitation agreements? Is that typical?
Very typical. I often am looking to try to make them match. Like sometimes they're a bit lopsided where it's like 1 year for the non-compete and like 3 or 4 or 5 years for the non-solicit. That's kind of really high. That's very rare to be that high. But sometimes like 2 years and 1 year side by side. So trying to get them as low as possible obviously is good, but 1 year and making them balanced is often a more attractive version of this clause for physician contracts.
Okay. Well, we're going to switch gears right now. Before this call, before we started the webinar, we were talking, and I mentioned I actually fractured my knee skiing last month and have been hobbling around on crutches. And you had mentioned that you're seeing a lot of cases where temporary disability starts coming into play and interacting with contracts. So we wanted to talk a little bit about what you should do in the case of a temporary disability and what does that mean for your job. So if you break your arm and you're a surgeon, what does that do?
Yeah, so I've had a couple recent examples of skiing, snowboarding, that sort of thing. So I don't do any of these things yet, so maybe I'm trying to stay away from them. I'm a
Don't.
little shy of this right now. It looks like a lot of fun. I've never done it before. I'm from Mississippi originally. We don't have a lot of snow skiing or snowboarding there, right? So, yeah. What happens though? You're a physician. What happens if you become disabled? Let's use the orthopedic surgeon as the hypothet here. Let's say you're skiing and you break your hand, heals up okay, but you can't do orthopedic surgery anymore. You now, I mean, you can walk around, you can see patients, you're still exceedingly skilled, but a higher end private practice orthopedic surgeon with like a built up, practice is probably making more than $1 million. But an orthopedic surgeon that cannot do surgery, probably going to be a lot more limited. They might make more like 250 to 500, who knows, right? It's going to be a significant dip. So, what happens if you are partially disabled from an accident and it lasts forever? We're going to get to the temporary disability part here in a moment too. But if you're partially disabled permanently, what happens under your contract? There are some protections under federal law for making reasonable accommodations for disability. Okay. But those can kind of clash a little bit with the employer's right to terminate without cause or whatever your compensation package really has, right? Like let's say they guarantee you in your compensation package a $700,000-$800,000 minimum salary, but now the thing that you do can't really support that anymore, then that's just not going to work out. So a lot of employers do have the right to terminate you for instance of disability after a certain period of time. I've had some limited success around negotiating that clause, But regardless of that clause, every physician should have a disability insurance policy that pays them out in that situation. Okay. What you want is a contract, a disability insurance policy that is that will pay you if you can't work in your own occupation, called own occupation policy. For our ortho hypo, if the orthopedic surgeon can't practice in the same way as they were practicing before the accident, okay, then the own occupation partial disability claim policy would then pay part of the difference. So let's say instead of $1 million, that physician can only do 400,000. There's a $600,000 difference. That policy is going to have some sort of math problem that provides some measure of support. Maybe not all 600K. Okay, that'd be a lot, but there's going to be some measure of support that helps that physician during that situation. You also want that to apply, obviously, if you are totally disabled, permanently totally disabled. You want that disability policy to pay out in full. Often physicians are still valuable in the workforce, even if they break a limb. Like, you can still see patients, you just can't do surgeries, and surgeries pay a lot more than just seeing follow-up patients, seeing clinic patients. So you want a policy that pays you even if you're still, you know, able to work. Some policies won't pay you anything, even if you, like, as long as you can work in some capacity. And those aren't super valuable. They're just not as valuable for physicians because just the nature of how physicians typically get injured, you know, it just depends. From a knee side, like, you're probably fine, but let's call it a hand for a hypothet. You know, let's say you can't, it's just a permanent thing. You can still do this webinar, right? Like, it's not going to really prevent you from doing that, but you know, it might prevent you from surgery. So understanding how that applies makes a lot of sense. There are some groups out there that really specialize in physician own occupation disability insurance policies that do it right. I'd encourage you to do that. Also, in the case of temporary disability, should understand what happens there. Typically, your employer will have a short-term disability policy that pays out for like 6 or 8 or 10 weeks if you're temporarily disabled. Okay, will typically pay maybe your base salary, maybe some portion of your base salary. This is usually how maternity leave is handled, by the way. You are determined to be temporarily disabled because of pregnancy, and then that policy will pay you some portion of your compensation. If you are temporarily partially disabled, then obviously the support is probably going to be relatively small, right? And then if it's temporary total, then that's usually where it comes from. Often for temporary total disability, a disability that just doesn't last very long, typically you don't actually get much money out of that because you just lose out on your productivity bonus for the year. This happens a lot in maternity leave, by the way. Let's say you have a job that pays you a minimum guaranteed salary of $400,000, okay? But you typically you see a lot of patients and you get a productivity bonus, and let's say your annual productivity bonus on average is $100,000. You make $500K, 400 from base, 100 from bonus. Let's say instead of working 48 weeks that year, you work 40 weeks that year. 38, 39 weeks. I can't do math on the fly, but the idea is if you work about 20% less that year because you're temporarily fully disabled, you're probably still making your base at $400,000, but now you work 20% less, so your bonus went from $100,000 probably to zero because you just earned enough to cover your base salary. So often, even if the short-term disability policy pays you money during maternity leave, if your employer is not like adding in, like updating your volume expectations for bonus purposes, you're just not getting paid for maternity leave. So very challenging piece for early career physician, mostly physician moms, obviously, but something to keep in mind.
Okay. Well, that's all the questions that I had prepared for you. Is there anything else that I should have asked you that you feel like we should cover before we close out here?
For students considering medicine, looking at medical school, looking at moving into residency, um, from I'll say from a physician contract lawyer perspective, pretty much every specialty will offer enough income support to live a very comfortable life. I would encourage you to not pick a specialty solely because you heard it makes more than another. It's not really the case. I also see a lot of variability within specialties. I have family practice doctors that make more than neurosurgeon clients. If the practice setting itself and the volume that you do as a physician is a little bit higher or a little bit more lucrative, for example, then you can certainly out earn more lucrative specialties. So your total comp is not only tied to specialty, it helps, okay? But there are other factors, and also just longevity of your career. If you pick something that makes you unhappy and you can only do it for like 5 or 10 years before you leave, you're just not going to make as much as someone who can happily do a career in medicine for 30 or 40 or 50 years. So I would encourage you to to pick a specialty based on what's interesting to you. It's really hard to like power through a job you don't like in medicine. A lot of people can do that in like other jobs, they punch in, punch out, but like medicine, that's not really on the table. It's not really an option. So I would think about that. From a student loan standpoint, I will say from my experiences in the firm, I have a lot of clients that achieve public service loan forgiveness. So you might want to consider picking a residency that counts towards PSLF. There's a lot of nonprofit academic residency programs. There's a handful of private residency programs. You can certainly consider those okay, but those are not going to help you accrue credit towards public service loan forgiveness. If you have a relatively bigger student loan burden, then you might want to consider PSLF. Just to back up for a second, public service loan forgiveness is a government program that will wipe away your student loans if you work for a qualifying employer, typically a nonprofit or a government employer, for 10 years. And residency and fellowship all count towards that. So, for example, let's say you're a neurosurgeon and you're in training for 8 years or 9 years, then you might only have a year or two left. You could have racked up a $500,000 in debt, but as long as you do it in a residency program, fellowship program that counts, and you work for an employer afterwards that counts, then that's still available. Obviously, these things can always change in the future, okay? Like, certainly may or may not be around forever. It really just depends on what happens politically. But I'll say from our experience at the firm right now, it works. And I would imagine most folks in this field will say that once you're in the program, you're typically grandfathered in. So if you have concerns about the program existing in the future, just try to make an informed choice. Those are the two maybe biggest things. I would say last thing, I guess quick plug. I'm working on an educational platform for physicians that want to learn more about physician contracts. It's going to come up soon, physiciancontracts.com. And I put together a course that is meant to be digested over a couple days, maybe over a weekend before you start interviewing for jobs, maybe 6 months to a year out before you're going to start looking for jobs, just to understand a lot of the issues we talked about today, physician contracts, a little bit of like the business of healthcare, a little bit of how do I negotiate contracts, how do I organize this next step to try to maximize my chances of having an attractive job, attractive contract, just understanding what's going on. The course is meant to address those questions. Very few residencies or fellowship programs offer foundational information, education, guidance on physician contracts and just the entry business of medicine. And my goal is to create a place where every resident and fellow can go get it. Like, we don't have to worry about not having access to it anymore. So that's coming soon. I'd love for folks to consider taking a look. But yeah, that's it.
Great. Yeah, looking forward to checking that out. It is definitely an area that is not covered as well for most physicians, most residents, most medical students is the system that they're going to be working in. So I think that's going to be a really good resource. And again, I just wanted to say thank you to Michael for taking time out from his evening to talk about all of these different topics and to drill down and give us some great information. You'll be able to, if you're watching this on a replay, you can feel free to go check out the Student Doctor Network for more information that can potentially help you in your journey to becoming a physician. And we'll also include links to his website and his bio information so that if you are looking to do some negotiation of your contract or you want some more information, you can reach out to him there. So again, thank you for joining us this evening and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.